I know you're good, but this don't feel good right now. And I know you think of things I could never think about. It's hard to count out all joy, distracted by the noise, just trying to make sense of all your promises. Sometimes I gotta stop, remember that you're God and I am not. Thy will be done, thy will be done, thy will be done. Like a child on my knees, all that comes to me is thy will be done, thy will be done, thy will. I know you see me, I know you hear me, Lord. Your plans are for me, the goodness you have in store. I know you see me, I know you hear me, Lord. Your plans are for me, goodness you have in store. So thy will be done, thy will be done, thy will be done. I know you see me, I know you hear me, I know you see me, I know you hear me. Yes, your plans are for me. I know you see me, I know you hear me, Lord. Your plans are for me, goodness you have in store.
Who wrote that? That is gorgeous.
Hillary Scott.
Oh, God, that was gorgeous. Thank you so much. Yeah. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Happy Sunday to you. Came across a story, and there was on an oppressed noonday hot day, a farmer sat under a walnut tree. And he was sitting there trying to get some rest. He'd been working hard in the sun. And as he sat there, he looked out over his pumpkin patch and saw the vines and said to himself, you know, God really is foolish and inexperienced. He put big, heavy pumpkins on a frail vine that has very little strength. You know, doesn't make a lot of sense. Even, he said, why didn't he put them on a walnut, on a tree like a walnut that could hold it up? And as he's sitting there contemplating this, a breeze came along and knocked a walnut loose, and it hit him on top of the head. He says, it's a good thing that wasn't a pumpkin. There is a power and a wisdom that is available and at work all the time. And that power and wisdom oftentimes can work through us. Notice I said can. And I'm going to suggest to you in some ways it always does, but we don't always see it or recognize it. And we confuse it. And we get kind of mixed up sometimes, it seems. And there's an English proverb that says, where there's a will, there's a way. I always liked that proverb. And I had a buddy growing up in high school named Will, and he always liked it also. He would remind me often, don't worry, but where there's a will, there's a way. And oftentimes that was the case. Will was pretty aware, pretty clever a lot of times. But I came across another saying from Addison Meisner who said, where there's a will, there's a lawsuit. But I'm bummed. Well, and I've been thinking about this idea of will, and our lesson series in the Quest has, our lesson this week is about will, and ask the question, why can't I do it my way? Why can't I do it my way? And I've been really contemplating that and thinking about, what does it mean, God's will? How many of you heard that term before? You know what I'm talking about? God, it's God's will, or it's not God's will. I remember growing up, my parents talking about a couple that lived down the street from them, and then they were friends with them, and there was a husband and wife that would come down, and they would come sometimes have dinners together, and my mom always would say something about this wonderful lady who always knew God's will. You know, and she would say to her husband, you know, if it was something that she really wanted, she would say, well, you know, Herman, it really is God's will. But if it was something she didn't want, it was, well, Herman, you know that's not God's will. It's funny how we have this idea about that, and that that there is a particular way of thinking that is, if it's in tune with what we want, we think it's God's will, and if it's not, then somehow it's not God's will. But you know, it really is about decision and choice. The word will really it means intention, it means choice, it means making a decision for, and it really means the ability to hold to that decision. And when we hold to a particular decision, we're using the power of our will to hold to that decision, to hold to that choice. And every one of us has within us that power. We are created in the image and after the likeness of the divine, and so there is a power within us of will that allows us to have a choice and to be able to hold to that choice. And one of the things that the lesson really talks about here is an understanding that in unity we have an understanding that ultimately the divine is absolute good. Absolute good. That's a challenging concept sometimes, because you know, when we are living out in our lives, in our world, we tend to experience things as dichotomous. We tend to think that there's good and there's not good, or there's good and there's evil, there's darkness and there's light. And I'm going to suggest to you that those are just simply our awarenesses and our perceptions. But in the truth of being, in the truth of reality, there really is only one presence and one power in this universe, and that presence and power is ultimately good. And it is a presence and a power that is continually working to express and to manifest even more of that into its creation and through its creation. And to raise, you might say, the energy and the vibration of that energy that we understand is good in our awareness, in our consciousness, in our thinking, so that we are resonating with the good that is already in a particular circumstance or situation. See, the good is already present. There's no way you can be absent from it, because that's what is. And the more we tune ourselves into that knowing, what we find is that we become a part of this unfolding creative process that allows that good to not only be manifest in our awareness and our vision and our understanding, but it actually begins to radiate and form and create and shape life and our world in such a way that not only are we experiencing a greater good, but we're becoming an instrument of that good to others in our life, in our world. I think that's what Jesus was trying to teach us. I really think that's the message that Jesus had for us. He came and said, I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. And one of the things he also said was, you know, someone came to him and said, good master. And he stopped him and said, why do you call me good? There is one good. There is one that is good, and that is the Father in heaven. Now, the idea of the Father in heaven is basically, if you look at the root word of what has been used as Father, it also translates as sire. And the word sire comes from the same root word as the word source. I always like that understanding, that basically Jesus was saying there's one source, and that source is good. There's one that is good, the Father, and there's one source. And we all are connected to and have a part in and are extensions, you might say, of that one source of all good. And so part of our work here, part of the will of God, if you want to call it that, or the will of the divine, is that there's a choice. And the choice ultimately has been made. The choice is ultimately to manifest and to express more of the divine good throughout creation. So in that sense, there's only one will. And that will is for benevolence, for a greater experience of good. Now, part of that wonderful, great opportunity that we have to be creative beings and to be expressions of the divine is that we are created in the image and after the likeness of the divine, and the divine is the very creative principle at work in the universe, right? And so if that's the case, and we're created in the image and after the likeness of that divine, of God, that means that we are created as creative beings. You are an instrument of creation. And if you think you're not, you're creating something anyway. Right? You are creating right now. And we are in the process of creation, whether we're conscious of it or not. And that's part of the amazing journey that we're on in this world and this life. And part of, I think, part of what you might call the divine will is part of what makes it possible for us to be a part of that is that we have to have the ability to make a choice, to make a decision. That's the exercise of will, isn't it? And if we're not making a choice and making a decision, we are basically puppets. And they're really ultimately, we're not extensions of that will. And so in order to really tune into and be what we are created to be, we are being given the gift, the ability, the power, as Charles Fillmore called it, one of the 12 powers is will. We have the ability to choose. And what we have the ability to choose is to experience and know and acknowledge more of that divine will of good, or to resist it. And sometimes we resist it. Maybe not consciously, but sometimes we resist what is. We sometimes resist the unfolding of that divine will. And sometimes we participate in it. And sometimes we have an idea of what that will is that is limited. And so we have a limited awareness of what our options are. And so we make decisions based on a limited awareness. And sometimes those decisions that we make that are based on limited awareness actually are made to try and avoid something, and made in a way that doesn't really allow us to be in the flow, you might say, of the greater possibilities of good. And sometimes we go through experiences in life that are difficult. Anybody notice that? Sometimes we go through experiences that are difficult, and it has been over millennia, I think, there's been an attribution that, well, it must be God's will for us to suffer. And I think this is a kind of a traditional view of many teachings, of many religions, that we're here to suffer, and that somehow, by suffering, that we are somehow going to be purified, which is another illusion, because reality is we don't need that, because we are created in the image and after the likeness of the divine. And this decision that somehow has been made, that somehow we need to be purified, is erroneous. And it doesn't need to be, we don't have to fight against that, we just have to make a different choice. And the choice really is to acknowledge and accept and recognize the essence of who and what we are. You're created in the image and after the likeness of the divine, and you have the ability to decide whether you're going to be in harmony with that and align yourself with that knowing, or you're going to make a decision that you are somehow less than, not a part of, separate from that which is divine. In Genesis, that's called the fall of humankind. See, we have that. We're still in the garden in many ways, and we're still falling sometimes because we're not necessarily choosing to recognize our connection and our oneness with Spirit and with the divine. Believe me, I do. I sometimes forget. I think that I'm me, and this little old being here that is less than, or interestingly enough, sometimes I think I'm less than, or sometimes I think I'm greater than. Either one, it's an illusion. You follow what I'm saying? You see, that's what the ego mind does. The ego mind is the mind of comparison. It is a mind that really thinks in terms of separation and distance and differences. But there is a mind that is within each of us that is also a mind of the one mind. And part of our unfolding spiritually is to practice and move into those spaces where we are open and allowing of a greater awareness to come into us and come through us in such a way that we can experience an elevation of light, of love, of peace, of compassion, of life, of wholeness. And when we do that and really begin to own that as a part of our own nature, then we begin to allow that to manifest more in an outer way. But we spend a lot of our time and energy trying to get the outer world to line up in certain ways based upon good and not good. And in the very process of doing that, we're believing that something out here is our source. And that if we can just get the world to be the way we think it's supposed to be, that's God's will, obviously, right? And so part of this amazing journey that we're on is learning how to allow the presence of a higher understanding and higher awareness to come through us, and to practice a knowing that that's always available to us and that we can tap into it in each moment all the time. And then we don't do that. We don't necessarily then say, okay, God, you messed this one up. Right? No. The more we can tune into that flow, the more we can tune into that awareness of our connection and our oneness with the divine, we become clearer vessels, you might say. Clearer vessels for a higher understanding and a higher energy and vibration of the one choice that was made. And that one choice, again, was a choice for good. And so part of our work is to practice moving in the direction of a higher awareness of that energy in some way. So how can we tell whether something is God's will or whether it's, our little ego monkey mind voice, which we all have? Yeah, that's fine. If you get some insight, I'm always open to them. Absolutely. How can we tell? Well, our lesson gives us three things that I think really are valuable. One, if something has already manifested, you can bet that it was God's will. Because if it shows up that creative process is always at work. You might ask, how could I know if something is God's will? My answer is, if it were not God's will, it wouldn't exist even for an instant. So if something happens, it must be God's will. If you truly enjoyed God's will, you would feel exactly as though you were in the kingdom of heaven, whatever happened to you or didn't happen to you. This is a quote from the great mystic Meister Eckhart. So think about that for just a moment. We have a tendency to decide that whatever is going on in our experience is bad. We don't like it. It's not what we wanted. Certainly not our preference. And then we wind up fighting and resisting it. And in some ways, it's kind of like trying to, what's a good analogy? It's kind of like you've taken an arrow and you've shot the arrow at the target, and the arrow is flying through the air, and it's like this far from the target, and you're saying, no, I don't like that shot, let's change it. And what I mean by that is, what you're seeing and experiencing out here is already manifest. It already is. And ultimately, there's one or two things that we can do with something that already is. We can resist it and say, ain't it awful? Ooh, this is terrible. I hate it. We can complain about it. Oh boy, that's all complain about everything that's going on right now. And that makes it different, doesn't it? How many of you have ever changed anything by complaining about it? We think we can. We think if we complain enough, it's going to change. Has it really ever worked for you? So we can work with it that way, or we can acknowledge that this is something that already is. And I'm a creative being. And I have the power of the divine working through me. Not to change what has already been created, but to change what is being created next. And the only time we have, and the only way we have to do that is right here and right now. And we do that by changing our choices. Instead of focusing on resisting what already is, make a choice. Use the power of your will to choose what you want to experience more of. And by doing so, you're allowing that divine will of greater good to work through you as a creative being, to choose a higher vibration, to choose a higher energy, to choose a greater peace, to choose a greater experience of health and wholeness, to choose a greater experience of abundance and prosperity. But, we get really comfortable with our, in some ways, I think we get some kind of gratification from being able to complain, don't we? I don't know what that is. I think we really like, there's something within us. Oh, let's put it this way. It's at least very familiar. Wouldn't you agree? And it's just a pattern that we have set up, thinking that somehow by complaining about what is, by resisting what is, by fighting it, by saying, ain't it awful, by trying to hold our nose and wade through it, that somehow we're going to make it different. And I'm going to suggest to you, you're actually just setting yourself up for the next thing, because you're putting out a vibration and energy of that kind of energy, and you're a creative being. And you're in the process of creating it. And you're in the process of creating that next thing you get to complain about. It's a gift. I love that saying. There's, whatever shows up, it's either a gift or a lesson. And either way, it's still a gift. And so part of the understanding about divine will is recognizing and really tuning into that possibility of knowing that whatever is happening, there's something there that is trying to move us to a richer, deeper experience of the power and the presence and the light and the love of the divine. Charles Fillmore in Christian Healing says that the will should never be retarded in its development, but it should be strengthened along all lines. And the idea of breaking the will of children is wholly erroneous. The perfect man is produced by rounding out the will and joining it to understanding. The idea of giving up the will to God's will should not include the thought of weakening it or causing it to become in any way less. It properly means that the will is being instructed how to act for the best. And so when we are open to the divine and open to the will, it does require us to be willing to let go of thinking that we have all the answers. It does require us to be open to recognizing that there is a part of us that is not really fully, perhaps, in tune with something that could be even greater. And so that's why it's essential to really be in an energy and a power of allowing. See, the word will, we sometimes think, we confuse will in many ways because there is a willfulness, and we know that one. We have a very clear idea of what's supposed to be. That was God's will, obviously. We have this idea that we can make reality be what we think it's supposed to be. And that's called willfulness. And we go through all kinds of gyrations to try and make sure that it is, don't we? Anybody feel like you kind of just need to have a little bit of control over things at times? Yeah, a little bit, maybe. Just a little bit, you know. Have to have a little control over, well, you name it, you know, them, it, that, yeah. Well, control ultimately, in some ways, is an illusion. We really don't have control. What we have is creativity. We have will. We have the ability to choose. And not the same as control. You don't have the ability to control someone out here. You don't have the ability to control circumstances. But you also do have the ability to not let circumstances necessarily control you. And that's the real power of using our will, is to recognize that circumstances don't necessarily control us. That we have the ability to make different choices, to think in a different way, to see things from a higher perception, to allow ourselves to even make incremental steps toward a greater sense of good, or as Abraham Hicks says, I like the term they use as well-being. Ultimately, the divine is an experience of well-being. And the more we tune into that experience of well-being, we resonate with that, and we become, as Jesus said, we become even more the light of the world. And I think that's a big part of our work, is to just take those steps, even if they're just incremental, to move this much closer to knowing our oneness and our wholeness, our peace and our power and our passion. And I think we're supposed to have fun with it personally. It's an adventure. We have this opportunity to be instruments of a greater good in life and to really allow the power of Spirit to work through us. In the synoptic study of the Unity teachings, it was put out many years ago by a collective of Unity teachers. It says this: one gets a good idea of the meaning of the will of God when he thinks of it as the ceaseless longing of the Creator to perfect him herself in that which she has created. And thus the will of God in humankind and the Christ in humankind are really one. Christ is that divine pattern and the divine idea seeking to express that wholeness. Ultimately, that is the will of the divine, is that power of the divine expressing through us in greater possibilities and potential. And Charles Fillmore says in Prosperity, he says, they say that it's God's will for us to have some hard times and some good times, feasts and famines. This is not logically true when you consider God as principle. If you think of God as a man who arbitrarily gives or withholds by the exercise of his personal will, you might reach such a conclusion. But God is changeless. And if God gives one moment, he will continue to give eternally. It is the nature to give, and that nature is eternally the same. So when you talk of hard times, famine, lack, or talking of something that has no place in the mind of the divine, you're speaking of something that has no place in the mind of the divine. So the will of God is the cosmic urge for higher self-expression. It's an urge for us to really come up higher and to be more of what we are created to be. And it is through the power of our will that we continually have the opportunity to choose. And so what I'm going to invite you to do is to really consider, what are the choices that I'm making right now in this moment? Am I open to a greater good? Am I open to something higher? I want to close my lesson today from a wonderful reading from J. Sig Paulson. Some of you are familiar with Sig Paulson, who was the minister for many years down at Unity in Houston. And this is from Your Power to Be. He said, the will of God is the cosmic urge for self-expression. The will of God individualized in me is my rapidly expanding desire for universal good. The will of God is the desire of infinite love, life, joy, and wholeness for self-expression through me and the rest of the community. The will of God is that I live up to my highest potential at all times and in all situations. The will of God is that I choose life instead of death, love instead of hate, health instead of sickness, prosperity instead of poverty, peace instead of war, joy instead of unhappiness. The will of God is that I expand my desire for good so that it includes all humanity, those of every race, creed, nation, and color. The will of God is that I am a successful human being, ever unfolding more of my spiritual potential and capacity. And the will of God is that I be successful in all enterprises, for the blessings and comfort of all humankind. And the will of God is that I shall come to know and appreciate the divine nature in me and in my neighbor and in all creation. The will of God is that I shall come to know and experience eternal life, beginning right now. And that's our lesson for this week. So let's have a little music and move into our meditation time.
You are the face of God. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God.
So take a nice deep breath and move into that place of stillness, of quiet, of peace, to that inner sanctuary where you know and are open to experiencing the presence of the divine within yourself. And just know and see that you have within you a divine mirror. I invite you to look into that mirror and see reflected back all aspects of your nature and being. Those parts of you that you really like and appreciate and value and love, and also those parts of you that you have trouble accepting and appreciating and valuing. And as you look in that mirror, see that face of the divine. And say these words to yourself in the mirror. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. And if there's some part of you that you just as soon wish wasn't there, just acknowledge that that part of you is part of you also. You are part of me. And say to that part of you, I love you. I love you. I love you. And in that energy of love, be open to the knowing that there's only one presence and one power, that is love, in you. It's always present, regardless of any resistance we have to things, circumstance, situations, people. We release and let go of any need to try and get any of that to change, and we choose to become the change by allowing love to be in our hearts, to be an expression of a higher choice. And sharing that choice through our thoughts, our words, our actions, our being. And just quietly and gently and silently say to that reflection in the mirror, you are an expression of the creative power of the universe. I love you. I love you. I love you. Take a nice deep breath. Let your awareness be in this room, this time, this place. Take another nice deep breath. Be present here and now. And just know that you are one with divine love. And that's the truth of who you are. Take another deep breath, and when you're ready, gently open your eyes. Be present here and now. We at Unity in the Heart of Austin are committed to inspiring people to awaken to their unique divine nature through spiritual teachings, through heart-to-heart connections, through prayer, and through sacred service. And we provide tools, spiritual tools, that allow you to live your best possible life. I'm Reverend Tony Roebuck, minister at Unity in the Heart of Austin, and I truly hope that you are inspired by and that you are transformed by, you enjoy this week's spiritual message. And if you would like to leave a donation, a tithe, to help the work of this ministry in supporting you and others like you, then we are truly grateful for your generosity and for helping to make the world a better place. Because we know that life is meant to be good.